The town of Copper Ridge had grown accustomed to watching women arrive with hope in their eyes and leave with tears on their cheeks. They came from neighboring counties, from cities back east, even from as far as California, all drawn by tales of Jackson Reese, the wealthy rancher who owned half the valley and had a face that could make angels weep. But Jackson Reese had built walls around his heart, higher than any fence on his property, and not a single woman had managed to scale them. Martha Hendricks watched from behind the counter of her general store as yet another hopeful young lady climbed into the afternoon stage, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. That made 17 this year alone. Martha shook her head, counting out change for old Pete Wilson, who grunted in agreement with her unspoken thoughts. "That boy's gonna die alone," Pete muttered, tobacco juice staining the corner of his weathered mouth. "Mark my words." But Jackson Reese wasn't a boy. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered and hard-muscled from years of working his land. His ranch, the Double R, sprawled across 15,000 acres of the finest grazing land in Montana territory. Cattle bearing his brand numbered in the thousands, and his horses were sought after from Denver to San Francisco. Money flowed through his fingers like water through a sieve, yet he lived simply, almost sparely, in the sprawling ranch house his father had built before the war. The people of Copper Ridge had their theories about Jackson's stubborn bachelorhood. Some said he'd loved a girl back in Virginia before the war, and she'd married another man while he was away fighting. Others claimed he'd sworn an oath to his dying mother never to marry. The boldest whispers suggested he simply preferred his own company to that of any woman foolish enough to chase after his fortune. The truth, as it often was, lay buried deeper than gossip could reach. On this particular October evening, Jackson stood on his front porch, watching the sun paint the mountains purple and gold. His foreman, Carlos Mendoza, approached with the day's tally book, boots crunching on the gravel drive. "Boss, that Pritchard girl left on the 4 o'clock stage," Carlos said, not quite meeting Jackson's eyes. "She was crying something fierce." Jackson's jaw tightened. "I never invited her here. I never gave her reason to hope." "You gave her attention. You were polite. To some women, that's enough." Carlos had been with Jackson since they were both young men, and he knew better than most when to push and when to let things lie. Tonight, he pushed. "Maybe it's time you told folks you're not interested instead of letting them figure it out the hard way." "I've told them." Jackson's voice carried the weight of exhaustion. "I've told everyone. They just don't listen." What Jackson hadn't told anyone, what he could barely admit to himself in the darkest hours before dawn, was that he'd learned long ago that wanting something badly was the surest way to lose it. His mother had wanted his father home from the war. She'd gotten a telegram and a folded flag instead. His sister had wanted a husband who would stay sober. She'd gotten bruises and broken promises until Jackson had sent the man packing with 2 black eyes and a warning never to return. And Jackson himself had once wanted someone to see past his grandfather's money to the man underneath. That particular lesson had cost him more than pride. So he'd made a decision that felt like wisdom at 25 and had hardened into stubbornness by 30. He would want nothing he couldn't control. He could control his land, his cattle, his business dealings. He couldn't control another person's heart, and he wouldn't put himself in a position to be destroyed by one ever again. The problem was that Copper Ridge and the surrounding territory seemed determined to find him a wife whether he wanted one or not. Mothers brought their daughters to church socials and accidentally seated them beside him. Business associates suggested he meet their nieces visiting from back east. Even Martha Hendricks had tried introducing him to her cousin's widow, a perfectly pleasant woman who talked for 15 minutes straight about her prize-winning preserves, while Jackson calculated cattle prices in his head to keep from screaming. He wasn't cruel about his rejections. He was polite, even kind, but ultimately immovable. No amount of batting eyelashes or practiced charm could penetrate the fortress he'd built around himself. After a while, it became a point of pride. He was the man who couldn't be caught, the wealthy cowboy who rejected all brides. What Jackson didn't know, as he stood on his porch that October evening watching darkness creep across his land, was that the universe had a sense of humor about men who thought they had everything figured out. 300 miles away, a woman named Sarah Colton sat in the corner of a railroad car, her few belongings wrapped in a bundle beside her. She wasn't heading to Copper Ridge looking for a husband. She wasn't looking for anything except a place to disappear, to fade into obscurity where no one knew her name or her story. She'd heard about Montana Territory from a kind missionary woman in Denver, heard it was big country where a person could get lost if they needed to. Sarah needed to get lost more than she needed her next breath. She needed distance from memories that clawed at her in the night, from expectations she could no longer meet, from a grief so profound it had hollowed her out and left nothing but a shell. The train rattled northward through the darkness, carrying Sarah toward a destiny she never sought and a man who thought he'd successfully avoided his. In Copper Ridge, Jackson Reese locked his front door and headed upstairs, confident in his solitude, secure in his decisions. Tomorrow would be another day of work, of managing his empire, of politely but firmly discouraging whatever woman next decided to try her luck. He had no way of knowing that tomorrow everything would change. He had no way of knowing that the woman who would finally breach his walls wouldn't be trying to get in at all. The morning stage pulled into Copper Ridge 3 days later, wheels churning up dust that hung in the autumn air like golden smoke. Martha Hendricks glanced up from sweeping her store's front steps, expecting to see the usual collection of drummers and drifters. What she saw instead made her stop mid-sweep, her practiced eye taking in details that told a story sadder than most. The woman who climbed down from the stage moved like someone who'd forgotten how her body worked. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back in a simple bun and a dress that had once been fine but now hung loose on a frame that had clearly known better days. Her face was pretty in an unremarkable way, the kind of face you might pass on the street without a second glance, except for her eyes. Those eyes had seen something terrible, Martha thought, and she'd been running a store in frontier towns long enough to recognize the look of someone running from more than geography. "Help you, miss?" the stage driver called down, but the woman just shook her head and stood there clutching her small bundle, looking up and down the street as if she'd arrived somewhere she hadn't quite meant to be. Martha set aside her broom and walked over. "You looking for someone, honey?" The woman's gaze took a moment to focus. "No, I mean..." Her voice was soft, cultured, Eastern. "Is there a boarding house or a hotel? Mrs. Chen runs a boarding house 2 streets over near the church. Clean rooms, good food." Martha studied the woman's pale face, the shadows under her eyes. "You all right? You look like you could use a meal and a place to sit down." "I'm fine, thank you." The automatic response of someone who'd learned to deflect concern. "If you could just point me toward..." "I'll walk you there myself." Martha made it sound like it wasn't up for debate. "Name's Martha Hendricks. I run the general store." The woman hesitated, then nodded. Sarah Colton." They walked in silence, Martha matching her pace to Sarah's slower steps. The boarding house was a neat, whitewashed building, with a front garden that Mrs. Chen tended with the same precision she applied to everything else in her life. A widow who'd come west with her late husband to build the railroad, she'd stayed on after he died and turned her home into a respectable establishment for travelers and the occasional newcomer looking to settle. Mrs. Chen took one look at Sarah and switched from businesswoman to mother hen in the space of a heartbeat. Within minutes, Sarah found herself installed in a small, clean room on the 2nd floor with promises of supper in an hour and instructions to rest until then. Sarah sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked around the room. A simple dresser, a washstand with a chipped basin, a window that looked out over the street. It was nothing like the spacious bedroom she'd left behind in Boston, with its silk curtains and imported furniture. It was nothing like the life she'd left behind, period. That was exactly what she wanted. She'd been running for 6 weeks now, ever since the morning she'd walked out of her family's Beacon Hill mansion with nothing but the clothes on her back and the small inheritance her grandmother had left her, hidden from her father's control. 6 weeks of trains and stages and cheap hotels, moving steadily west and north, putting distance between herself and the future that had been planned for her since birth. That future had died 3 months ago, along with her fiancé. No, that wasn't right. That future had been a lie long before Thomas died. She just hadn't wanted to see it. A knock on the door pulled her from thoughts she didn't want to think. Yes? It's Martha Hendricks, dear. I brought some things I thought you might need. The older woman came in carrying an armload of supplies, soap, a hairbrush, a shawl that looked hand-knitted. Don't worry about paying. Consider it a welcome to Copper Ridge. I can't accept, Sarah started, but Martha waved her off. Yes, you can, and you will, because that's what folks do here. We help each other. She set the items on the dresser, then turned to study Sarah with sharp but not unkind eyes. You planning to stay, or just passing through? I don't know yet. The honest answer surprised Sarah as much as it probably surprised Martha. I need work. I can read and write. I can keep accounts. I taught piano lessons back. Before. Before what? Martha asked gently. Sarah shook her head. Just before. Martha accepted this without pushing. Well, there's not much call for piano teachers here, but we could use help at the schoolhouse. Miss Porter's been trying to manage 30 children on her own, and she's about worn to a thread. Doesn't pay much, but it's honest work. That would be perfect. Relief flooded through Sarah. Work would give her purpose, routine, something to think about besides the endless loop of memories that played in her head whenever she stopped moving. Good. I'll introduce you tomorrow. Martha headed for the door, then paused. One more thing. You'll hear talk about Jackson Reese. Every newcomer does, especially the young pretty ones. Don't pay it any mind. Who's Jackson Reese? Martha laughed, though there wasn't much humor in it. The wealthiest rancher in 3 counties and the most stubborn bachelor in Montana territory. Women come from all over trying to catch his eye, and he sends every last one of them packing. I'm telling you now so you won't waste your time. I'm not looking for a husband, Mrs. Hendricks. Something in Sarah's tone made Martha take a second, longer look. No, I don't suppose you are. Well, that's refreshing at least. Get some rest, honey. Supper's at 6. After Martha left, Sarah unpacked her meager belongings and washed her face in the basin. The mirror above the washstand showed her a stranger, hollow-eyed, thin-faced, with none of the spark that had once made people describe her as vivacious. Thomas had loved that spark. He'd loved how she laughed at his jokes, how she could light up a room just by entering it. How she believed in fairy tales and happy endings. What he hadn't loved, what he'd hidden until 3 weeks before their wedding, was that he'd already gambled away most of his family's fortune and had his eye on hers. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal, though that had stung. The worst part was the relief she'd felt when the carriage accident had killed him. She was supposed to be in that carriage with him, heading to yet another tedious society function. But she'd pleaded a headache at the last minute. He'd gone alone, driving too fast as he always did, and the carriage had overturned on a rain-slicked road. Everyone had called it a tragedy. They'd expected Sarah to grieve, to wear black, to retreat into proper mourning. Instead, she'd felt nothing but a terrible, guilty relief that she wouldn't have to marry him after all, followed immediately by crushing shame that she could think such a thing about a dead man. Her father had been furious when she'd refused to mourn appropriately. "You'll ruin your reputation," he'd thundered. "You'll embarrass this family." When she'd suggested maybe taking a year before considering other suitors, he'd informed her that he'd already been approached by Thomas's cousin, a man 15 years her senior who saw her grief as an opportunity. That was the night Sarah had decided to run. She pulled off her traveling dress and lay down on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow she would meet the schoolteacher. Tomorrow she would start building some kind of life in this small western town where nobody knew her name or her story. Tomorrow she would take the first step toward becoming someone new. But tonight, in this quiet room 3,000 miles from everything she'd ever known, Sarah Colton finally let herself cry for the girl she'd been and the future she'd thought she wanted. She cried until she had no tears left, until her body was empty and her mind was numb. She didn't cry for Thomas. She cried for herself, for the loss of innocence, for the shattering of illusions, for the death of the romantic dreams that had carried her through childhood and into young womanhood. When she finally slept, she dreamed of wide open spaces and endless sky, of a place where the past couldn't follow and the future was nothing but blank possibility. 2 miles outside town, Jackson Reese sat in his study going over the books, trying to concentrate on numbers that blurred together on the page. Carlos had mentioned earlier that a new woman had arrived on the stage. Young, alone, clearly not from around here. Jackson had tensed, waiting for the inevitable introduction, the knowing looks, the matchmaking attempts. But hours had passed, and no one had come knocking. No messages about dinner invitations or chance meetings had arrived. The new woman apparently had no interest in meeting the wealthy rancher who rejected all brides. Jackson told himself he was relieved. He didn't examine why relief felt oddly similar to disappointment, or why he found himself wondering what this woman looked like, this stranger who'd arrived wanting nothing. Sarah's first week in Copper Ridge passed in a blur of new faces, new routines, and the blessed exhaustion that came from working with 30 children of varying ages and abilities. Miss Porter, a brisk, efficient woman in her 40s, had welcomed Sarah's help with visible relief and immediately put her to work teaching the youngest children their letters, while Miss Porter handled the older students. The children were curious about their new teacher, peppering her with questions she deflected with practiced ease. Where was she from? Back east. Did she have family? Not anymore. Was she married? No. Would she marry their fathers, uncles, older brothers? Absolutely not, and please pay attention to your penmanship. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a simple wooden building with rows of benches and a wood stove that barely kept the autumn chill at bay. Sarah arrived early each morning, lit the stove, and prepared lessons until the children began trickling in. She stayed late, helping the slower students with their reading, cleaning slates and organizing supplies. The work kept her mind occupied, kept her from dwelling on things she'd rather forget. Martha Hendricks stopped by regularly with food, gossip, and the kind of straightforward friendship that didn't require explanations. Mrs. Chen fussed over Sarah's thin frame and insisted she take second helpings at dinner. Even the local minister, Reverend Bailey, made a point of welcoming her to the community without the usual probing questions about her past or her intentions. For the first time since leaving Boston, Sarah felt like she could breathe. She'd been in Copper Ridge for 10 days when she first heard the full story of Jackson Reese. She was having tea with Martha at the general store after school when a cluster of ranch wives came in, gossiping about the latest woman who'd set her cap for the wealthy bachelor. Victoria Hammond actually showed up at his ranch uninvited, one woman said, her tone balanced between scandalized and impressed. Said she was lost and needed directions, though everyone knows she grew up here and could find her way blindfolded. What did he do? Another asked, leaning forward. Had Carlos escort her back to town, polite as you please. Didn't even invite her inside for water. The woman shook her head. That man's made of stone, I swear it. Or he's just waiting for the right woman, a third suggested hopefully. Maybe someone less obvious, less calculating. Martha caught Sarah's eye and raised an eyebrow. Sarah shrugged, stirring sugar into her tea. The romantic troubles of a wealthy rancher meant nothing to her. She had her own troubles, and they were quite sufficient, thank you. But the universe, as Martha liked to say, had a strange sense of timing. 2 days later, Sarah was leading her youngest students in a nature walk, a Friday afternoon treat when the weather was fine and the children had earned it through good behavior. They were examining leaves near the creek that ran behind the schoolhouse when 8-year-old Tommy Brennan somehow managed to slip on the muddy bank and tumble straight into the cold water. The creek wasn't deep, but Tommy couldn't swim, and the current was stronger than it looked. Sarah didn't think. She kicked off her shoes and waded in, her skirts immediately soaking up water and becoming heavy as lead. She grabbed Tommy by the collar just as he went under a second time, hauling him back toward the bank with strength she didn't know she possessed. The other children were screaming. Sarah's feet kept slipping on the creek bottom. Tommy was coughing and choking, his weight dragging her down. For one terrible moment, she thought they'd both go under. Then strong hands gripped her arms, lifting her and Tommy both clear of the water in one smooth motion. Sarah found herself deposited on the bank, dripping and gasping, while a tall man in work clothes set Tommy down and immediately began checking him over with the competence of someone who knew what he was doing. "He's all right," the man said after a moment, his voice deep and calm. "Just scared and cold. Tommy, you know better than to play near the creek." "Sorry, Mr. Reese," Tommy wheezed, his teeth chattering. Sarah's head snapped up. She took in the man properly for the first time, tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark hair and darker eyes, strong features that were more striking than handsome, and an air of quiet authority that made the panicking children immediately settle down. He wasn't looking at her. All his attention was focused on Tommy, making sure the boy was truly unharmed. "What happened?" Jackson Reese asked, glancing around at the circle of children. 7 voices tried to explain at once, a jumble of accusations and defenses that boiled down to Tommy showing off and Sarah diving in to save him. Jackson's gaze finally moved to Sarah, still sitting on the ground in her soaked dress, her hair falling down around her shoulders. Their eyes met, and something strange happened in that moment. A flicker of recognition that made no sense because they'd never met before. Sarah felt it like a jolt of electricity, unexpected and unsettling. From the way Jackson's expression shifted, she thought he felt it too. He looked away first, standing and pulling off his coat. "You need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch pneumonia." He held out the coat to her without meeting her eyes again. Pride warred with practicality. Sarah was shivering violently now, her fingers already numb. She took the coat, wrapping it around her shoulders. It smelled like leather and horses and wood smoke, clean, masculine scents that were nothing like the cloying cologne Thomas had worn. "Thank you," she managed, "and thank you for helping with Tommy. I was riding past and heard the screaming." Jackson turned back to Tommy. "Can you walk?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Let's get you home. Your mother's going to want to check you over herself." Jackson looked at Sarah properly for the first time since that initial meeting of eyes, and she watched him register details, her Eastern accent, her educated speech, the fact that she was clearly the new school teacher everyone had been talking about. "You're Miss Colton?" "Yes." Sarah stood on shaky legs, very aware that she looked like a drowned rat, and that her dress was plastered to her body in a way that would have scandalized Boston society. "And you're Mr. Reese?" "Jackson." He said it automatically, then seemed to regret it, a slight frown creasing his forehead. "We should get these children back to the schoolhouse. Miss Porter will be worried." He was right. Sarah gathered her students, doing a quick head count to make sure no one else had decided to go swimming. Jackson hoisted Tommy onto his horse and swung up behind the boy, then led the way back through the trees toward the schoolhouse at a pace the children could match on foot. Miss Porter was indeed worried, standing on the front steps, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. When she saw the procession approaching, Sarah soaked to the skin, Tommy on horseback with Jackson Reese, the other children chattering excitedly. Her hand flew to her mouth. Good Lord, what happened? The story came out in pieces while Miss Porter bustled around getting Sarah a blanket and sending one of the older boys to fetch Tommy's mother. Jackson stood off to the side, clearly planning to leave now that his good deed was done. But Miss Porter caught his arm. Jackson Reese, you stay right there. I want to hear your version before you disappear. He sighed but stayed, giving a characteristically concise account of what he'd seen. Sarah pulling Tommy from the water, both of them struggling, his decision to intervene. He made it sound unremarkable, as if anyone would have done the same. She saved his life, Jackson said, nodding towards Sarah. If she hadn't gone in when she did, the current would have taken him downstream. There's rapids 100 yards down. Sarah hadn't known about the rapids. The knowledge made her feel dizzy. Tommy's mother arrived in a state of terror that dissolved into tears of relief when she saw her son was safe. She hugged Sarah, thanked Jackson, scolded Tommy, and promised to bring dinner to the boarding house as thanks. Then she swept Tommy away, still lecturing him about safety and obedience and giving her heart attacks. Miss Porter finally released Jackson with a stern admonition to be careful riding home. That horse of yours is too spirited by half. He's fine, Margaret. Stop worrying. But there was warmth in Jackson's voice, the easy affection of old friends. He turned to leave, then paused and looked back at Sarah. She was wrapped in the blanket, still shivering, her hair a tangled mess. She probably looked ridiculous. She found she didn't care. You did a brave thing today, Jackson said. Foolish, maybe, but brave. Not many people would risk themselves for someone else's child. I'm a teacher, Sarah replied. Those children are my responsibility. Responsibility doesn't always translate to action. He said it like he knew from experience. Then he gathered his horse's reins and swung into the saddle with an ease that spoke of years in the saddle. You should get inside and get warm. And he hesitated, seeming to fight an internal battle before adding, Thank you for taking care of Tommy. His father died last year. His mother's doing her best alone. Then he was gone, riding off toward his ranch in the distance, leaving Sarah standing there wondering why her heart was beating so fast and why she couldn't stop thinking about the moment their eyes had met. Well, Miss Porter said, breaking the silence, that was Jackson Reese. So I gathered. He's a good man, better than most people give him credit for. Miss Porter studied Sarah with sharp eyes. He doesn't usually stop and talk to strangers, especially not young, pretty strangers. I'm not pretty, Sarah said automatically, and I was hardly at my best. Miss Porter smiled. You're shivering. Come inside and get dry before you prove Mr. Reese right about the pneumonia. That night, lying in her narrow bed at the boarding house, Sarah replayed the day's events in her mind. She thought about Tommy's weight dragging her down, the cold shock of the water, the strength in Jackson Reese's hands as he'd lifted them both clear. She thought about his eyes, brown, she now knew, dark brown like coffee, and the way he'd looked at her for that one brief moment before looking away. She thought about how he'd called her brave, and how long it had been since anyone had seen her as anything other than broken or disappointing or in need of fixing. Most of all, she thought about the strange flutter in her chest when he'd thanked her, and how she'd specifically chosen Copper Ridge, because Martha had mentioned a wealthy rancher who had no interest in marriage. Because Sarah had no interest in marriage either. She'd learned that lesson thoroughly, so why couldn't she stop thinking about Jackson Reese? Jackson told himself he wasn't looking for her. He just happened to be riding past the schoolhouse more often. He just happened to stop at Martha's store when he knew Miss Colton usually took her lunch break there. He just happened to ask Carlos about the new schoolteacher in what he hoped was a casual, disinterested tone. Carlos wasn't fooled. You like her. I don't even know her. You want to know her. That's worse. Carlos had known Jackson long enough to recognize when his boss was lying to himself. She's different from the others. That was the problem. Sarah Colton was different. She didn't simper or flirt. She didn't manufacture reasons to bump into him at the general store or suddenly develop an interest in horses that required his expert advice. In fact, she seemed to actively avoid him, which made her the first woman in 5 years who treated him like he might be contagious. It was driving him crazy. Over the next few weeks, Jackson found himself cataloging details about Sarah the way he might study a particularly puzzling mare. She walked to the schoolhouse early every morning, her steps quick and purposeful. She wore the same 3 dresses in rotation, all of them worn and mended but clean and neat. She never looked up when men rode past, never smiled at the young ranch hands who tipped their hats, never seemed to notice when conversations stopped as she entered a room. She was, Jackson realized, actively trying to be invisible. It made him wonder what she was hiding from. The town gossips had plenty of theories. She was running from a bad marriage. She was an heiress escaping her family. She'd committed some terrible crime back east. She was heartbroken over a lost love. The speculation grew wilder by the day, fed by Sarah's refusal to discuss anything about her past. Jackson found he didn't care what the gossips thought. He wanted to know the truth. His opportunity came 3 weeks after the creek incident. The town was preparing for its annual harvest dance, a tradition that brought ranchers and farmers and townspeople together for an evening of music and socializing. Jackson usually made a brief appearance out of obligation, then escaped as quickly as possible before the matchmaking could begin in earnest. This year, he found himself looking forward to it. "You're going to ask her to dance," Carlos observed, watching Jackson try on 3 different shirts before the dance. "I'm not asking anyone anything." "Boss, you've changed shirts 4 times. You're asking her to dance." Jackson gave up on pretending. "What if she says no?" "Then you'll survive. You've survived worse." Carlos clapped him on the shoulder. "But she won't say no. I've seen how she looks at you when she thinks no one's watching." "How does she look at me?" "Like you're a puzzle she can't quite figure out. Like she wants to but is afraid of the answer." Carlos grinned. "Basically the same way you look at her." The dance was held in the largest barn in the territory, on Marcus Thornton's ranch. The entire space had been decorated with lanterns and autumn flowers, and a band from Helena was playing fiddle music that echoed off the rafters. By the time Jackson arrived, the place was packed with people drinking punch, eating pie, and spinning across the makeshift dance floor. He spotted Sarah immediately. She was standing near the refreshment table with Miss Porter and Martha Hendricks, wearing a dress he hadn't seen before, dark blue, simple but flattering, with her hair pinned up in a way that emphasized the graceful line of her neck. She was smiling at something Martha said, and Jackson felt his chest tighten at the sight. When was the last time he'd felt like this? When was the last time a woman had made him want to cross a room just to be near her? Never. The answer was never. He was halfway across the barn before he consciously decided to move. Sarah saw him coming, and her smile faltered, replaced by something that looked like panic. For a moment he thought she might actually run, but she held her ground, lifting her chin in a gesture he was beginning to recognize as her way of facing things that frightened her. "Miss Colton." He stopped a respectful distance away, acutely aware of Martha and Miss Porter watching with undisguised interest. "You look lovely tonight." "Thank you." Her voice was steady, but her hands were clasped tightly together. "The barn looks beautiful. Mrs. Thornton must have worked very hard." Small talk. Safe. Jackson could do safe. She did. She always does. He paused, gathering courage he hadn't needed since he was 17. "Would you like to dance?" The panic in her eyes intensified. I don't think that's a good idea." "Why not?" "Because..." She glanced at Martha, who was making encouraging shooing motions, then back at Jackson. "Because people will talk. People always talk. Let them. He held out his hand, palm up, making it an invitation rather than a demand. One dance, Miss Colton. That's all I'm asking. Sarah looked at his hand like it might bite her. Jackson could see the war playing out behind her eyes, the urge to flee versus something else, something that looked like longing. Finally, so slowly he thought she might change her mind halfway through, she placed her hand in his. Her fingers were cold and trembling. Jackson closed his hand around them gently, anchoring her, and led her onto the dance floor. The fiddles were playing a waltz, slow and sweet. Jackson put his hand on Sarah's waist and felt her stiffen, every muscle locked tight. This close, he could smell lavender soap and see the fine lines of tension around her mouth. This close, he could see that she was terrified. "Breathe," he said softly, beginning to lead her through the steps. "I'm not going to hurt you." "I know." But she didn't sound convinced. They danced in silence for a moment, Jackson keeping his movements simple and predictable, giving her time to adjust. Gradually, he felt some of the tension leave her body. She wasn't a natural dancer. She kept trying to anticipate his moves and getting the timing wrong. But there was something endearing about her concentration, the way she bit her lower lip when she made a mistake. "I'm sorry," she said after stepping on his foot for the third time. "I'm terrible at this." "You're doing fine." He meant it. "When's the last time you danced?" "6 months ago, at a party in Boston." The words came out before she could stop them, and he felt her tense again, as if she'd revealed too much. "Boston's a long way from here." "Yes." She wouldn't meet his eyes. "It is." Jackson wanted to ask why she'd left, what she was running from, why she flinched when men got too close. But he knew pushing would only make her retreat further. So instead he said, "Tommy's mother wanted me to thank you again. She's been making extra pies all week trying to figure out how to repay you." That got a small smile. "She doesn't need to repay me. I'm just glad Tommy's all right. He hasn't been near the creek since. I think you scared him straight." "Good. I'd rather he be scared than drowned." They turned, and Jackson caught sight of half the town watching them. Victoria Hammond looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. Mrs. Chen was beaming. Martha was giving him 2 thumbs up behind Sarah's back. "Everyone's staring at us," Sarah said, having noticed the attention. "Does that bother you?" "Yes." She finally looked up at him, and this close, her eyes were hazel, green and gold and brown all mixed together. "I came here to disappear, Mr. Reese. Dancing with you is the opposite of disappearing." "Jackson," he corrected automatically. "And maybe disappearing isn't what you need." "You don't know what I need." "You're right. I don't." He held her gaze. "But I'd like to find out." Sarah missed a step, and Jackson steadied her, his hand tightening on her waist. For just a moment, she let herself lean into his strength, and he felt something shift between them, a crack in the walls they'd both built, a possibility neither of them had been looking for. Then the music ended. Sarah pulled away immediately, stepping back and dropping into a small curtsy. "Thank you for the dance." She was gone before he could respond, disappearing into the crowd like smoke. Jackson stood alone on the dance floor, watching her retreat, feeling like he'd just lost something he hadn't known he wanted. Carlos appeared at his elbow. "Well, that was interesting." She ran. "She's scared, can't you see it?" Carlos had a way of cutting through Jackson's blind spots. "That woman's been hurt, boss. Badly. You're going to have to be patient." "I don't know how to be patient with this." Jackson ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I don't know how to be anything with this. I've spent 10 years pushing women away, and the first one I actually want to get close to can't run fast enough." "Maybe that's why you want her, because she's not chasing you." Carlos grinned. "Or maybe it's because she's the first woman you've met who needs something more than your money." Jackson thought about Sarah's worn dresses, her too thin frame. The way she threw herself into teaching like work was the only thing keeping her afloat. Carlos was right. Sarah Colton didn't need his money. She needed something he wasn't sure he knew how to give. She needed someone to see her, to really see her past the walls and the fear and the carefully maintained distance. She needed exactly what he'd been denying himself for 10 years. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He'd built his fortress to keep women out, to protect himself from being wanted only for his wealth. But in doing so, he'd also shut himself off from the possibility of being wanted for himself. He'd become so good at being alone that he'd forgotten what it felt like to want someone else's company. Until Sarah. Across the barn, Sarah had found sanctuary in a corner with Miss Porter, trying to calm her racing heart. She'd felt it during the dance. That dangerous flutter of connection, the pull of Jackson's quiet strength, the way his hand had steadied her when she stumbled. It was exactly what she'd promised herself she wouldn't feel again. "He's a good man," Miss Porter said quietly. "I'm sure he is." Sarah took a sip of punch, willing her hands to stop shaking. "But I'm not looking for a good man. I'm not looking for any man. Sometimes the best things are the ones we're not looking for." Sarah wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. Because part of her, a part she was trying desperately to ignore, was starting to wonder if Miss Porter might be right. Winter came to Copper Ridge with a vengeance, bringing snow that piled 6 feet high and temperatures that made the schoolhouse stove work overtime just to keep the room bearable. Sarah threw herself into teaching with renewed dedication, staying late to tutor struggling students and arriving early to make sure the building was warm before the children arrived. It was a good distraction from thinking about Jackson Reese, except Jackson seemed determined not to be ignored. He started showing up at the schoolhouse with firewood, claiming he had extra and the children shouldn't freeze while trying to learn their lessons. He brought supplies from Martha's store when Sarah mentioned they were running low on slates and chalk. He fixed the broken window that had been leaking cold air for weeks, appearing one Saturday with tools and new glass, refusing payment or even thanks. "Just being neighborly," he'd say, then disappear before Sarah could form a proper response. Martha found the whole thing hilarious. "That man's courting you the only way he knows how, by being useful. It's actually kind of sweet." "He's not courting me." Sarah sorted through primers, avoiding Martha's knowing look. "He's just helping the school." "Oh, honey, you really believe that?" The truth was, Sarah didn't know what to believe. Jackson's attention was nothing like Thomas's had been. Thomas had courted her with flowers and poetry, with grand gestures and elaborate compliments. He'd made her feel like the center of the universe, like she was special and perfect and everything he'd ever wanted. It had all been a lie designed to access her inheritance. Jackson brought firewood and fixed windows. He asked about her students and actually listened to the answers. He never tried to touch her, never pushed for more than she was willing to give. His presence was steady and patient, like he was willing to wait however long it took for her to trust him. It was terrifying. 2 weeks before Christmas, a blizzard hit that shut down the town for 3 days. Sarah was snowed in at the boarding house with Mrs. Chen, listening to the wind howl and watching the snow pile higher. On the 3rd day, when the storm finally broke, she woke to find someone had cleared a path from the boarding house to the schoolhouse and left 2 cords of wood stacked by the door. She knew without asking who'd done it. That afternoon, against her better judgment, Sarah asked Mrs. Chen for directions to the R Ranch. "You're going to see Jackson Reese?" Mrs. Chen's face lit up like sunrise. "About time. But you can't walk there in this snow. Let me ask Mr. Henderson if he'll drive you in his sleigh." "I can walk. 3 miles in snow up to your knees? Don't be silly. Besides, showing up half-frozen would ruin the effect." "What effect?" Sarah asked, but Mrs. Chen just smiled and went to arrange transportation. An hour later, Sarah found herself being driven up a long, snow-covered lane toward a ranch house that was bigger and more impressive than she'd imagined. It was built of logs and stone, sprawling and solid, with smoke rising from multiple chimneys. Horses dotted the nearby pastures, their breath steaming in the cold air. Everything spoke of prosperity, permanence, and careful management. The sleigh stopped in front of the main house. Mr. Henderson helped Sarah down, then said he'd wait while she conducted her business. Sarah climbed the front steps and knocked before she could lose her nerve. Carlos Mendoza answered the door, took one look at her and grinned. "He's in the study, down the hall, third door on the right. Go on in." The house was warm and beautifully furnished, but in a masculine, practical way. Leather furniture, Indian rugs, bookshelves lined with volumes that looked actually read rather than decorative. Sarah found the study exactly where Carlos had indicated and paused outside, gathering her courage. Through the partially open door, she could see Jackson bent over a desk, writing something in a ledger. He'd removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, and Sarah was struck by how different he looked here in his own space, relaxed, focused, completely at ease. She knocked softly. Jackson looked up, and the expression that crossed his face when he saw her, surprise, pleasure, cautious hope, made her heart skip several beats. "Sarah." He stood quickly, nearly knocking over his chair. "Is something wrong? Are you all right?" "I'm fine. I came to—" She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her because this conversation needed privacy. "I came to thank you for the firewood, and for clearing the path, and for the window and all the other things you've done that I haven't properly thanked you for. You don't need to thank me." Jackson moved around the desk, but stopped several feet away, maintaining that careful distance he always kept. "It wasn't any trouble. It was absolutely trouble. You rode out in a blizzard to help people who aren't even your responsibility." Sarah took a breath, forcing herself to say what she'd come to say. "Why? Why what? Why are you being so kind to me? What do you want?" Jackson's expression shifted, became more guarded. "I don't want anything. Everyone wants something. Thomas wanted my money. My father wanted me to marry well and increase the family's standing. Even the missionary woman who told me about Copper Ridge wanted me to find God." Sarah's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking, so she clasped them together. "So what do you want, Jackson Reese?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face like he was trying to memorize it. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I want to know why you flinch when men get too close. I want to know what happened in Boston that made you run 3,000 miles. I want to know if you ever smile when you're not forcing yourself to." He took a step closer, and another, until he was near enough that Sarah could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. "I want to know if I'm the only one who feels this thing between us, or if you feel it too and are just better at pretending you don't." Sarah's breath caught. "I feel it." "Then why do you keep running?" "Because the last time I trusted a man with my heart, it turned out he only wanted my inheritance. Because 3 months before our wedding, I discovered he'd been gambling away his family's money and saw me as his salvation. Because when he died in a carriage accident, I felt relieved instead of grief. And what kind of person does that make me?" The words poured out, years of guilt and shame and anger finally finding their voice. "I came here to disappear, Jackson, to become someone who doesn't hope or want or trust. And then you show up with your firewood and your patient eyes and your steady hands, and you make me want things I promised myself I'd never want again." Jackson closed the remaining distance between them, slowly enough that she could have stepped back if she wanted. But Sarah didn't step back. She stood her ground as he reached up and gently cupped her face in his hands. "What kind of person does that make you?" he repeated softly. "It makes you human. It makes you someone who recognized a bad situation and felt relief at escaping it, even though the escape came at a terrible cost. There's no shame in that, Sarah. But I should have loved him. I should have grieved. You can't force feelings that aren't there. And you can't punish yourself forever for being honest about it. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, a touch so gentle it brought tears to her eyes. I spent 10 years pushing away every woman who came near me because I was convinced they only wanted my money. I built walls so high I forgot what it felt like to want someone for themselves. And then you showed up, wanting nothing, needing nothing from me, and suddenly my walls felt like a prison. I do need things from you, Sarah whispered. That's what scares me. What do you need? I need you to be patient while I learn to trust again. I need you to be honest with me, even when the truth is hard. Her voice broke. I need to know this is real, not just another pretty story that'll fall apart when reality sets in. Jackson leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture of intimacy that was somehow more profound than a kiss. I can be patient. I can be honest. And I can promise you this is real, because I've never felt like this before. I've never wanted someone's happiness more than my own comfort. I've never looked at a woman and thought I could spend the rest of my life learning everything about her and still find new things to discover. Sarah closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. This was the moment where she could pull back, where she could protect herself by maintaining the walls she'd built. Or she could take the risk of believing him, of trusting that not every man was like Thomas, that not every love story ended in betrayal. She thought about the past 3 months, the running, the hiding, the exhausting work of being no one and wanting nothing. She thought about Jackson's steady presence, the way he'd respected her boundaries while quietly demolishing them through simple kindness. She thought about how it felt to dance in his arms, to be seen as brave instead of broken. She thought about what Miss Porter had said. Sometimes the best things are the ones we're not looking for. Sarah opened her eyes and found Jackson watching her with an expression that made her chest ache. Hope and fear and longing all mixed together, a mirror of everything she was feeling. I'm still scared, she said. So am I. What if I'm not ready? Then we'll wait until you are. Jackson's hands slid down to her shoulders, steadying her. I've spent 10 years alone, Sarah. I can wait however long it takes. What if I'm never ready? What if I'm too broken? You're not broken. You're healing. There's a difference. He smiled, and it transformed his entire face, making him not just striking, but genuinely handsome. And I happen to be excellent at patient waiting. Ask anyone in town. Despite everything, despite the fear and the tears and the weight of the past, Sarah laughed. It was a small sound, rusty from disuse, but genuine. Jackson's smile widened at the sound, and Sarah felt something inside her chest begin to uncurl, like a flower hesitantly reaching toward sunlight. Okay, she said. Okay? Okay, I'll try. I can't promise I won't panic or run or do something stupid, but I'll try to trust you, to trust this. She took a shaky breath. Will you take me to dinner at Mrs. Chen's boarding house tomorrow? Not as a grand gesture or a courtship ritual, just as two people sharing a meal and talking. I would like nothing better. Jackson's voice was warm with promise. Though I should warn you, by tomorrow evening the entire town will know, and Martha Hendricks will probably have already picked out wedding china. Let them talk. I'm tired of being invisible. Sarah stepped back, creating physical distance while something in her expression remained open in a way it hadn't been before. I should go. Mr. Henderson is waiting with the sleigh, and I need to prepare lessons for Monday. Jackson walked her to the door, helped her into her coat, and stood on the porch watching as the sleigh pulled away. Sarah looked back once and found him still standing there, silhouetted against the warm light of the house, and felt her heart do that dangerous flutter again. This time, she didn't try to fight it. The next evening, Jackson arrived at the boarding house at precisely 6 o'clock. freshly shaved and wearing what was clearly his best shirt. Mrs. Chen seated them at a small table by the window, served them pot roast that melted off the bone, and managed not to hover obviously, while still keeping the other boarders from intruding. They talked for 3 hours. Sarah told him about growing up in Boston, about her mother who'd died when she was young and her father who'd never quite forgiven her for not being the son he'd wanted. About teaching piano to spoiled society girls and dreaming of doing something more meaningful with her life. Jackson told her about losing his father in the war, about building the ranch from near bankruptcy into the success it was today, about his sister who'd died young and the nephew he'd raised until the boy was old enough to go east for school, about the loneliness of being wanted for what you have instead of who you are. "I understand that," Sarah said quietly. "Being wanted for the wrong reasons. So we're both running from the same thing, just in different directions. Maybe we can stop running now." Jackson reached across the table and took her hand, and this time Sarah didn't flinch. She laced her fingers through his and held on, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip, the solid reality of his presence. Over the next few months, Jackson courted Sarah the way he did everything, steadily, patiently, and with absolute sincerity. He took her driving in his best buggy on Sunday afternoons. He attended the school Christmas pageant and clapped louder than anyone when her students performed. He brought her books he thought she'd enjoy and sat quietly in the boarding house parlor while she read aloud to him. He also introduced her to his life, showing her the ranch, teaching her to ride one of his gentler horses, explaining the business of cattle and breeding and land management. Sarah discovered she had a head for numbers and started helping him with his books on evenings when he'd ride into town after a day's work. The town watched in amazement as their confirmed bachelor and the mysterious schoolteacher became inseparable. The gossips had a field day, but Sarah found she didn't care. For the first time in years, she was happy, genuinely deeply happy, in a way that had nothing to do with meeting others' expectations and everything to do with being exactly who she was. Jackson was happy too. His friends noticed the change, the way he smiled more easily, laughed more freely, seemed lighter somehow. Carlos took full credit for the transformation and accepted congratulations with the air of a man who'd accomplished something significant. Spring came to Montana with a rush of wildflowers and warming winds. On a Sunday afternoon in April, Jackson and Sarah rode out to a high meadow on his property, where the grass was green and the mountains rose purple in the distance. They spread a blanket and ate the lunch Mrs. Chen had packed, then lay back and watched clouds drift across the impossibly blue sky. "I want to ask you something," Jackson said after a while. Sarah rolled onto her side to look at him, her heart already knowing what was coming. "All right. I know we've only been courting 6 months. I know you said you needed time, and I meant it when I said I'd wait however long it took." He sat up, taking her hands in his. "But Sarah, I've never been more sure of anything in my life than I am about wanting to spend the rest of my life with you. So I'm asking, not because I think you should be ready, but because I am ready. Will you marry me?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but these were different from the tears she'd cried in her narrow room at the boarding house all those months ago. These were tears of joy, of relief, of finally believing that happiness wasn't just for other people. "Yes," she said, and then because once wasn't enough, "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." Jackson let out a breath he'd been holding and pulled her close, holding her like she was something precious and fragile and absolutely essential. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms while the wind whispered through the grass and the mountains stood witness. "You know Martha already has the wedding planned," Sarah said eventually, her voice muffled against his chest. "She's had it planned since our first dinner together. And everyone will say they knew all along this would happen. Let them say it. They'd be lying, but let them." Jackson pulled back just enough to look at her face, to memorize this moment. "I had no idea this would happen. I thought I'd spend my life alone by choice. I thought wanting someone meant making yourself vulnerable to hurt. It does mean that, Sarah said seriously. Wanting someone always means risking hurt, but it also means risking joy. And I think... She paused, finding the words for a truth she was still learning. I think the joy is worth the risk. They were married on a Saturday in June in the small church in Copper Ridge, with the entire town in attendance and Martha Hendricks crying into a handkerchief the size of a tablecloth. Sarah wore a simple dress of ivory silk that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew and carried wildflowers from the meadow where Jackson had proposed. Jackson wore his best suit and couldn't stop smiling, even when Reverend Bailey's sermon ran long and Tommy Brennan fell asleep during the vows. At the reception in Marcus Thornton's barn, the same barn where they'd shared their first dance, Sarah and Jackson took to the floor for the first waltz as husband and wife. This time, Sarah didn't miss a step. This time she looked directly into Jackson's eyes and let him see everything she was feeling. The love, the trust, the absolute certainty that this was exactly where she belonged. "You're smiling," Jackson observed. "I'm happy." "Good. That's my only job now, keeping you happy." "That's not how marriage works," Sarah corrected, though she was still smiling. "We keep each other happy. Even better." They danced until the music stopped and the stars came out, until the last guests had departed and only the closest friends remained. Then Jackson drove Sarah home to the ranch, their ranch now, in the buggy decorated with tin cans and ribbons, courtesy of some enterprising cowhands. The ranch house welcomed them with warm light spilling from the windows. Carlos had made himself scarce, leaving them to their privacy. Jackson carried Sarah over the threshold because tradition mattered, but also because he wanted any excuse to hold her close. "Are you still scared?" he asked, setting her down gently in the front hall. Sarah considered the question honestly. "A little. But it's a different kind of scared than before. It's the fear of having something so precious you're terrified of losing it, not the fear of being tricked or betrayed. I can work with that kind of scared." Jackson cupped her face in his hands, the gesture that had become their signature intimacy. "I love you, Sarah Reese. I'll love you when you're scared, when you're happy, when you're angry at me for tracking mud across your clean floors. I'll love you through everything life throws at us, for as long as we both shall live." That's quite a promise from a man who rejected all brides. "I didn't reject all brides. I rejected the wrong brides. I was waiting for the right one." He kissed her softly, a promise and a beginning. "I was waiting for you." Sarah kissed him back, no longer afraid of wanting, no longer ashamed of needing. She'd come to Copper Ridge broken and determined to stay that way, convinced that feeling nothing was safer than risking everything. She'd been wrong. Sometimes the best things in life were the ones you weren't looking for. Sometimes the people who needed you most were the ones who claimed they needed no one. And sometimes two people who'd rejected love for entirely different reasons could find each other in an unlikely place and build something beautiful from the pieces of their broken pasts. Outside, the Montana night stretched vast and star-filled across the sky. Inside, in the ranch house that had known too many years of loneliness, two people who'd both been running finally stopped and found home in each other's arms. The wealthy cowboy who'd rejected all brides had found his wife, and the woman who'd wanted nothing had found everything.